Hello, everyone, and welcome to UNA-NCA's first coffee chat of the year. It is a pleasure to see each of you as we kick off our celebration of Interfaith Harmony Week. First and foremost, this is, like I said, the first coffee chat of the year. This is part of a series that we launched in 2020 as a way to come together to discuss some of the pressing global challenges at hand in a very dynamic and exciting way, to offer our members and friends in the community unprecedented access to some of the leading experts within our field. And today we have a wonderful panel with us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Interfaith Harmony Week. Thank you very much for joining the first edition of our Coffee Chat series this year. The series, as you have probably heard from Shayna, was launched in 2020 and brings together experts from several sectors to discuss and engage on timely topics that affect us both globally and locally. Our mission at the UN Association of the National Capital Area, which is among the largest and most active chapters of the UN Association of the USA, is to educate and mobilize our members to support the work of the UN and its agencies, and to foster a constructive leadership role of the US in the international community. Together with our sister organization, the Better World Campaign at the UN Foundation, we constitute the largest movement of Americans advocating for a strong US-UN partnership. As our country enters a new era of global engagement, this mission, our mission, is more critical than ever. And I hope you will consider joining UNA-NCA if you're not yet a member and get actively involved in our work this year. World Interfaith Harmony Week, observed the first week of February, was adopted by the UN General Assembly, Resolution 65-5, and it recognizes the critical need for dialogue among different faiths and religions in enhancing mutual understanding, harmony, and cooperation among people. It reaffirms the mutual understanding and interreligious dialogue constitute important dimensions of a culture of peace. And it encourages all states to support on a voluntary basis the spread of the message of interfaith harmony and goodwill in the world's churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, and other places of worship during the week, each according to their own religious traditions or convictions. This year's theme is Building Bridges Across Boundaries, and is also the inaugural International Day of Human Fraternity, which is observed on February 4th. So I'm delighted to have with us experts from different sectors who are going to share their experiences and views as we come together and build a culture of peace. So now back to you, Shayna, who is instrumental in putting together this series for UNA-NCA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. And while I set some ground rules, I'm launching a poll just for us to get a sense of who's in the room. Have you previously attended a coffee chat? And are you a member either of UNA-NCA or another chapter? Like we said before, this is one of my favorite discussion series that we host as part of our work, and a couple of ground rules. So for the first 45 minutes of today's discussion, we'll be going back and forth with speakers. The last 15 minutes or so will be dedicated to an audience Q&A. To keep this running smoothly, we ask that you keep yourself muted and enter discussions, comments, questions, everything in the chat. Engage in the chat throughout, and we'll be making sure to look through that so that all those questions get answered at the end of today's discussion. So with that said, and it looks like with the majority of respondents answering this poll, it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers we have on this call with us today. James Alexander is joining us as a Senior Policy Advisor in the U.S. Department of State's Office of International Religious Freedom Strategic Religious Engagement Unit. Pulwasha Cocker is the Acting Director for Religion and Inclusive Societies at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Catherine Marshall is a Senior Fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a Professor of the Practice of Development, Conflict, and Religion in Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And Saurav Upadhyay is currently the Research Manager for Learning and Evaluation for Interreligious Peacebuilding at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Now, let's just dive right into it. Paula mentioned in her introduction an overview of why Interfaith peace and peacekeeping and why Interfaith Harmony is celebrated by the UN. Now, oftentimes I've found that when we're talking about peacekeeping in a UN context, we're thinking maybe about conflict zones, maybe about UN peacekeepers. But as we know, building and sustaining peace is linked to developing strong institutions and infrastructure, access to basic services, poverty alleviation, access to education, some of those central determinants of conflict. So today we're going to explore the landscape of interreligious engagement to build and sustain peace. Palwasha, I'd like to start first with you. Broadly speaking, what is the role of faith-based groups in achieving peace and sustainable development?
Thank you, Shaina, for that question. You know, there's a lot of different ways to look at this. We have faith-based organizations, there's formal institutions that are religious formal institutions, there's religious actors, there's those that are clergy, that are official religious actors, and then there's maybe what we call non-traditional religious actors, women, youth, those that are parts of different parts of society. And so there's lots of different roles that these different religious actors, institutions, and organizations play in peace building. And at USIP, we like to look at all the broad range of actors and really look at the, processes in inclusive ways when we look at peace building. Some things to take into account are looking at the role that religion plays in society, but also the role that religion might play in a specific conflict dynamic or the conflict at that time. And so it's important to understand that religious actors and institutions might play a role in a specific circumstance. So right-sizing religion is what we like to talk about, that not religious actors and religious institutions, religious faith-based organizations may not be the best suited for all circumstances, but there are certain circumstances where they definitely do play an important role. And there are also different stages of the conflict where they can play an important role. There's a lot of literature, for example, on religious actors, institutions, faith-based organizations playing a role in reconciliation. We hear a lot about the role in truth and reconciliation commissions and whatnot. But what's little heard about is in the earlier stages of conflict. What kinds of roles do they play in de-escalating conflict? So, for example, USIP has done some projects in Nepal and Sri Lanka, working with interfaith councils at the local level, where they listen to what communities are saying about each other. If they start hearing that there's this negative word on the street where it might escalate the conflict, might cause violence on the streets, they work together to, within their own communities, de-escalate, bring ground truths, really break apart the rumors that people are spreading about the other religious organization or the other religionists in their communities, to really de-escalate the conflict. So there's different stages of the conflict that religious institutions can, and actors and faith-based organizations can be involved in and can be effective, but also it also depends on the type of conflict. So I just wanted to problematize that question a little bit and give some examples. And so another is, you know, facilitating dialogue. We see a lot of religious actors bringing that moral voice, that moral authority to be able to bring the different sides of the conflict and facilitate a dialogue towards a peace process. I mentioned reconciliation, and of course there's their role in humanitarian relief and development work. There's a lot of faith-based organizations that are working in that. One of the things that we studied in Myanmar and Burma was looking at Parahita networks in the Rakhine state. And these are networks that are volunteer networks related to religious organizations or that are connected with religious groups, where they do volunteer social work, charity work, and they organize themselves. And it's across the board, even though the word is used in the Buddhist context, there are Muslim and Christian Parahita networks as well that work on the ground. So you can see the various different factors and different intersections that religious organizations and actors and faith-based organizations work at peace building. So it's a very broad question. I'm trying to give sort of a summary here, but I hope that gives you a better picture of the broad range where religious actors and faith-based organizations and institutions can really engage on peace and development.
It absolutely does. And to start narrowing the focus, starting broad and moving into a more focused lens, I want to move to Catherine. Can you give us a sense of the role that religion can play specifically in development?
Well, many religious communities and organizations would say that the whole notion of development, which you might call human progress or looking for well-being, has a religious origin, which is true in the sense that religion was integrated in every sector: health, education, agriculture, land tenure, you name it, from time immemorial. So today, there are countless organizations that have religious affiliations that are involved. Well, we focus a lot, and of course, this is a United Nations inspired community here. The Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 goals, 169 targets. Every single one of them has some form of religious community involvement, whether it is sanitation, whether it is peace building, etc. So that comes, of course, to number 17, which is partnerships, which is, in a sense, the guts of it all, that we know that it is working together. What complicates this, and I'll follow Palasha with this sense that we have the sort of simple stories, you know, that every religious tradition yearns for peace. Every community has some inspiration from peace. But the reality is that for a long time, many of the formal development organizations, including most UN operational agencies, the UN itself, rarely took religious communities into account. They may, at the local level, they often dealt with them, but in a generic overall sense, they were blind. I worked for many years for the World Bank, and I think to this day, the World Bank doesn't have a category for religion in the library or in the information system. So that has changed a lot. Jim Wolfenson, the president, started a dialogue process with religious institutions in 1999. But I do have to say that all hell broke loose when that happened, that there was very lively questioning and active opposition to the idea of working with religion. So to use our stock answer, it's complicated. But what we're seeing now is a very wide range of partnership arrangements, of collaborations, some tensions, particularly, I hope one topic we will acknowledge and look at is some of the complexities around gender relations and women's roles, reproductive health. There clearly are many areas, and there are huge divisions and tensions within religious communities. The idea that there is a faith sector is, to me, a nonsense, because we're talking about potentially well over 80% of the world's population having some religious affiliation. It is an extraordinarily diverse, complicated field, and that explains in part why many of the non-religious actors are still trying to get their minds around what it means to look at the religiously linked organizations in their field of work.
Still, I find it, despite complications, your note about the World Bank a little surprising. Pivoting from maybe a global scale to a domestic scale, James, how does religion factor into US soft power and foreign policy? And how has that changed, in your view, in the last decade, working under distinct foreign policy agendas within the Department of State?
Thank you, Shanna, and thank you very much for having me here with you. It's a pleasure to join this group. Following after Palasha and Catherine is always a little bit daunting, so I'll try to do my best. I'd like to say that from the standpoint of religion and our foreign policy institutions, it has been a bit challenging. And Catherine talks about how a lot of different groups, and the World Bank being a great example, are a difficult or don't necessarily recognize religion as being this sort of entity that should be necessarily included in discussions of peace or discussions of lots of foreign policy goals. And that has been traditionally the approach within the US government as well. We can talk about it from an establishment clause standpoint and sort of limitations on what government can be active in. But yet, in the last 25 years or so, that has really been changing. We begin in 1998 with the IRFA, the International Religious Freedom Act, which starts to focus the United States more formally on issues of international religious freedom. And then it is over the last 10 years or so that the State Department, where I work, has become more and more focused on finding ways to work with religious communities in trying to achieve all host of ideas and issues. And the reality is that religious communities are part of civil society. And civil society is something we work with all the time. So just on that basis, well, we should be considering religious actors. But in addition to that, it goes further, is that religious actors are often closer to certain issues. They're often the best choice among civil society for us to work with. You know, whether it be peacekeeping, whether it be education, there are all kinds of different issues and opportunities there. At the same time, even as we've expanded sort of our role and our attention, and it's been a challenge within the department, we have to recognize that we're the United States. We're a state, and we're a big state at that. And we have to be very aware of the people we're working with, and we have to be aware, really, to be fair to them. I mean, there's a term we use, or a concept we use, which is not to instrumentalize religious actors in the work that we do. So it's not just take them to get to some end that we want. It's to find meaningful partnership, which is an open dialogue, an open discussion, and always has the opportunity for the religious actors we might work with, whether they be formal institutional religious leaders or working with faith-based organizations and so on, that they need to be able to make their own choices and that we should not be forcing them into anything. And in a very goal-oriented institution, that can be a struggle at times. And we always have to kind of keep on putting that up front as we make it, as we approach our policy goals, et cetera.
I want to circle back to this conversation that's emerging about engagement of relevant actors within the religious space, as well as this concept of right sizing. But first, I want to get to Saurav, because Saurav, your role is particularly unique. I'd like to hear about some of those frameworks that Alliance for Peacebuilding uses to monitor and evaluate interreligious programs. In other words, what does success look like? What's the measure of success when it comes to these types of engagements and partnerships?
Sure. Thank you, Shana. Thanks for having me. And just want to echo James, it's kind of daunting to follow such esteemed colleagues. But yeah, I'll start by sort of answering the first part of that question. So we at the Alliance for Peacebuilding are basically a network, and we don't ourselves implement any interfaith programs, but we do partner with interfaith organizations from all over the world, and do offer them sort of programmatic and evaluation support. And one thing that we do is we don't generally like to prescribe any particular methodology or tools, especially because evaluating sort of interfaith action, engagement is really challenging. Interfaith programs are really context dependent. They have a really longer life cycle. It doesn't necessarily fit into sort of project cycles. And a lot of times they work in such like dynamic conditions. And also when it comes to, if you think about monitoring evaluation, in terms of evaluating sort of interreligious programs and interfaith programs, we are also sort of trying to capture changes that are sort of really intangible and are really hard to capture. So I just want to kind of say that it is challenging, but some of the sort of frameworks that we ask folks to sort of follow is probably like, first of all, we really ask sort of interfaith actors to really think about the evaluation questions that they want to answer. So really think about what is it that we want to know about our program, about our project. You know, do you want to know what type of changes you've sort of, you know, you've caused? Do you want to know more about the causation, the causal pathway about the changes? So we really ask them to focus on that first. The second sort of suggestion and second sort of advice that we usually offer is thinking through and really thinking about involving all of the stakeholders in the evaluative process. So, you know, we ask them to sort of engage with stakeholders often and early in the process, and, you know, try to find the evaluation questions and things that you want to find out about the program through the engagement with your stakeholders. So, you know, and then interfaith programs, the stakeholders could be like a wide range, you know, so program participants, donors, and I particularly am sort of really partial to participatory pedagogy and participatory evaluation. So this is a point of great pride, and yeah, I really try to push this framework especially. And the third suggestion I think we generally try to make is around really thinking about the utility of the evaluation. Like, what is it that you are going to do with the evaluation? So before you embark upon that evaluation, really think about, okay, so once this is done, once we go through this process, how are we going to use the results, the findings? Are we going to improve our programs? Are we going to try to push for policy change? So we generally sort of prescribe these three basic things, you know, and we don't generally prescribe any sort of tools or methodologies. In terms of measures of success, I kind of want to borrow Catherine's words and say it's complicated. You know, as with many of these things, there are many different types of interreligious work, and I particularly work specifically with organizations that are engaged in interreligious or interfaith dialogue. So one thing I can say is that there has been a lot of work done to build up sort of research, build up the evidence base for measures of success, and all of this is actually built upon work that USIP has been doing for the longest time. And, you know, I could point to a research work that one of my colleagues, Kitty Oloni, out of the Wolf Institute is doing. She has a project called Measures of Success. So I'll be happy to share that with you in the chat or whatever, but I don't want to go into sort of the details and take too much time. But just want to say, yeah, it's complicated because of the typology and the different goals of the interfaith dialogue, but it's also like a work in progress because the evidence base of what constitutes success is constantly and continuously being built. So I'll leave it at that for now.
It's the two emergent themes. It's complicated and it's challenging. Saurav, I want to hone in on that point where you talked about involving all stakeholders. Question for the group: how inclusive are interfaith peace-building processes at all levels? Maybe another way to approach is, how can interreligious efforts better engage relevant actors like women and youth? Maybe Paulasha, you can start us off.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point, and we often struggle quite a bit with making sure the processes are inclusive of religious actors, and then when we do include religious actors, it's which religious actors do we include and how do we make those decisions? And you know, particularly looking in the UN context, my experience observing in Afghanistan and Libya, the inclusion is often with those either religious actors who are part of the conflict parties, who are parties to the conflict that are involved and sit at the table, like the Taliban, for example, are sitting at the table. But then in terms of religious actors on the other side, there's not as much of an avenue for them to participate. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is in UN-led processes, for example, in Libya, they talk about inclusion, they bring a broad base of religious actors, of course, formal religious actors, not the informal or the non-traditional religious actors aren't necessarily there, haven't been there. And then they're sitting in a separate room. So you have women in one room, religious actors in another room, and then the parties to the conflict in another room actually having their dialogue and negotiations. And so maybe there are some members of the party that'll actually travel to the different rooms, or a mediator travels to the different rooms, but it's not an inclusive table where everybody's sitting around the table. So that's another issue that's come up. But I think the biggest challenge is really, on the one hand, getting inclusion, understanding the importance of inclusion and how to do an inclusive peace process with everybody at the table and having a voice, but also being able to identify the right people to participate. And so how do you identify those women religious actors that are not clerical, that are not part of, you know, some sort of formal hierarchy, but have a lot of influence in the community? How do you identify the youth religious actors who have, you know, huge swaths of the population that follow them and look to them for spiritual guidance, but they're not part of a traditional religious system as we understand them? So it's identifying those people, identifying their influence, understanding where they actually sit and what kinds of constituencies they have, and then bringing them to the table in a process that really gives them a voice. It's participation, that they're actually there, and it's not just that they're sitting symbolically on a seat in some room where, you know, supposedly there's inclusion and somebody's going to come talk to them, but there's not real participation.
I'm going to accept the invitation we were given to jump in, and to follow very much from what Palwasha is saying, that why are we concerned about this issue? Why is inclusion so much an issue when you talk about religion and peace? And it is partly because so many religious leaders, let's be formal religious leaders, are men and are older. And it is one of the issues that people who come from different traditions say, why should we pay attention to these people who are not democratically elected, who are all men, who are older, and who may have views about women and youth which don't jibe very well with the overall understandings of a democratic society, particularly. So that is, I think, one reason why we've taken so hard a look. And of course, again, let's remember Resolution 1325, the extraordinarily low numbers of women who have been involved in formal peace processes. And then when you go to look at women, all you have to do is look at photographs of interreligious gatherings. There are almost no women there. So how do you counter that? And I think what Palwasha has emphasized is two things. First of all, and I think I did with Susan Hayward from USIP, we looked at what we call this Bermuda triangle of women, religion, and peace. And so the first thing is that there actually are extraordinary women who have a religious inspiration, doing remarkable work for peace in many different traditions. The ones who may be the most visible are some of the feisty nuns that we all admire, the Catholic sisters who are so courageous and who are fearless and who are standing up pretty much to everybody. But there are also people from any tradition. And so there is this book, USIP, that looked at a number of both individuals, but also sort of the ways in which women are involved in different traditions. I think one issue, and I'll stop there because I did just jump in, but it depends on how we're defining peace. So if the notion is that it's a table where people are sitting and selected and they're negotiating and they come out with a written document, that actually is not the way most peace processes work these days. It's much more complicated, much more multi-layered. But also, what are we talking about with peace? And here we get into what Sarav was talking about in the beginning, is looking way back at what are the seeds of conflict. And How do you prevent? How do you anticipate? How do you forestall the kinds of tensions and pressures? We're looking at that right now in the context of the COVID crisis, where we're seeing all kinds of new fault lines and traditions that are emerging. But then also the idea that you sign an agreement and you move on to DDR, to demobilization, and that's the end of the process. We all know that's not true. So in some sense, every aspect of development, whether it's education or health, is linked to the peace process. And in that way, it's much easier to look at inclusion as including a much wider range of people than the formal person who actually sits at a table in their tall hat and who negotiates across the table.
Did I jump in on this time? Many of us have learned from the work that Catherine and Pawasha's colleague Susan Hayward have done, and a book they wrote, I guess it was in 2018, and that specifically talks about sort of women as becoming, they're kind of invisible in their activity at times within religious communities, because the men of a certain age tend to be the bosses within these religious traditions, and yet the women are often doing so many amazing things, as Catherine described with the nuns, the feisty nuns. I can think of some nuns working regarding HIV/AIDS and Ebola, and certainly out there right now engaging issues related to COVID. And this is a complication in all of this for an institution like the State Department, because we are a formal body and we have to function all the time with issues of protocol and so on, and the people that we engage. And so what that means sometimes is we really kind of have to do this, almost this formal directional process to make sure women are involved in events. So we, for example, had an event that we co-sponsored with the Swiss a couple of years ago, in which we brought religious actors in from the areas around the Democratic Republic of Congo to have a conflict prevention event. And to make sure that we had women involved, there was a requirement that women be involved, and that at least one member of each delegation, and typically is about a 3-member delegation, would have a woman participating in that. But at the same time, because we are still trying to get our arms around this whole issue of engaging religious actors in all kinds of different issues that we're involved in, it really does focus to something that both Pawasha certainly said, and Catherine alluded to, is that we need to do good landscape analyses. We need to know what's there. And Pawasha's organization, USIP, is particularly good at this. They've been doing some amazing work as of late. And what this really allows us to know, and allows our people, our foreign service people on the ground, is what does it look like? Who are the people that are really working in these areas? Because we can invite individuals if we know they exist. And there is a strong push within the State Department for gender involvement, broad gender involvement in all the sorts of initiatives that we do, and particularly in these peace building areas. And as Catherine described it, it does involve education, it does involve health, it does involve the economy. It's all very interwoven. And so we're trying different things. And yes, I guess the two themes, again, it's complicated and it's a challenge. And I'll leave it there.
It's a concise, very concise summary for us to leave today's conversation with. But given these disjunctures that you've all spoken to, I think it's appropriate to circle back to what Pawasha mentioned at the top of our conversation, this idea of right-sizing the role of religion. I want to talk about this concept, the secularization thesis, the idea that as societies progress and industrialize, they become more secular. Is there a risk of overstating the role of religion in peace building?
I'm sure we can all jump in, but the answer is yes, it is possible. And every conflict that we look at, whether it's Myanmar, Central African Republic, the United States today, we know that there are multiple factors that are involved in conflict, and there can be a great deal of dispute about it. I'm always struck in a discussion, say about Nigeria, that one person will say, this is basically a religious conflict, Muslim Christian, and somebody else will say religion's got nothing to do with it. It's malicious politicians blowing it up. But on this secularization theory, just to say, the assumption for a long time, and still is true, I think it's still held by a number of people, is that as societies become more developed, people become more educated, religion fades in importance. And, the facts simply don't bear that out. In fact, there are projections that one number, the 84% of the world's population has a religious affiliation. Their numbers suggesting it will go to 87%. By the way, the main reason for that is that a lot of very religious communities have higher birth rates. And I'm not frankly convinced by those numbers. I don't think we have a clue really what's going to happen in 10 to 15 years. But so the thesis is wrong. But the part of it that is important to keep in mind is that religious traditions are changing and the role of religions in societies is changing. So for example, the nature of pluralism is changing. For a lot of the fact that people in many societies can change their religion, that is, again, not part of historic tradition. So religious traditions are dynamic, they're splitting, they're so many different manifestations of it. So I think the understanding, it's one of the things we talk about a lot, is the goal of religious literacy. That we think that, I teach at Georgetown, everybody who goes to Georgetown should emerge with some understanding of the role of religion in today's world. And that's true of any university, in my mind. It's part of the basic education in most societies, if not all. So, and then you also need within religious traditions some kind of development or some peace building literacy, so that they are able better to navigate and contribute, because everything crosses over. It's not a world where people live in silos.
I'll just quickly jump in. I don't want to steal too much time here. To say from our standpoint, we would actually say that the risk comes more from understating the role of religion in peace building. And it's not so much whether religion is a problem or a positive force in these particular cases, in the sense that we're looking at, in the work we're doing within the department, we want to make sure that religion is considered as a factor. Now, how the Foreign Service actor, the Foreign Service officer, and others working in the field then responds from that, well, that's largely up to them. And they should be considering the sorts of things that Catherine is talking about. And yet, we want to make sure that they're thinking about it. I mean, I can give an example in the sense that we've done some work in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is a heavily Christian society with various churches. And in the post-Mugabe era, we're dealing with issues of, well, how do we come to some sort of reconciliation? How do we find peace that sort of mimics on some levels, though the situation is different, for like South Africa? What's happened in South Africa under Mandela, Desmond Tutu, another religious actor working in this area. But and the issue here is the churches are so strong, it's really hard to imagine that we're going to find peace and reconciliation of some sort in the society without the churches being involved. And so that has to be part of the consideration in the discussion.
I want to ask one final question before we move over to our audience Q&A. given that, at least my impression is that while secularization thesis may be incorrect and to me seems very Western, if you will, given that it is a prevalent theory, and we've long had this association of modernity being secular and being Western, how then can we best engage in conversations and action around interfaith peace building? And maybe we could start with Sarav and then move to Paulasha.
Sure, yeah, I think I would sort of echo what James just said. I think we could do that by giving, faith actors their due. I feel like faith actors have brought their prophetic voice to so many sort of movements for social change. If you go back to like the civil rights movement, I used to work for a Quaker organization. I had no idea the role that Quakers played in the civil rights movement, and their work often is quiet and it's long term. It often does not get that due. But whenever something bad happens through a religiously motivated, incident, then religion are sort of put down, right? So I think, in a sense, religion, faith does not get its due for the sort of prophetic, long-term and quiet work that faith actors do in a lot of the world. And I think in terms of how best to engage, I think like a good way to engage is sort of like seek out faith actors who are sort of making space for movements for social change. So, and a perfect example is right now the Poor People's Campaign, which is a faith-led campaign, towards social justice and social change that addresses economic and social inequality. So I would say that would be a really good way to engage in that space. And yeah.
So I think it's important when we talk about right-sizing religion to understand the context. And as Catherine and James and Saurav also mentioned, oftentimes religion isn't given their due, or there's that not enough engagement on the religious aspect. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there are certain instances and certain times and places when religious actors and institutions can be more effective than in other instances and circumstances. And so understanding that is really important, and being able to do the right kind of conflict analysis and looking at the role of religious actors in a particular context, given in a particular time, which is what we do a lot with the religious landscape mappings that James mentioned, is helpful in understanding when exactly is the right time and the right place to engage with religious actors that can really be effective in the work that they're doing. Another aspect that I wanted to mention is I think what doesn't get said enough is the importance of intra-faith peace building and religious harmony, social cohesion, however you want to put it, happening, as well as inter faith dialogue and social harmony. And one of the things that I've noticed that international actors often come into is thinking, oh, we need to bring the different religious groups together to talk on an interfaith level between different religious groups, without starting first within a religion and recognizing the diversity within a religion and the issues that need to be resolved before they can move forward internally. And so that's another aspect I wanted to mention, is important to look at as we're engaging with religious actors in the space of peace building and in development work. Because it can turn into more competitiveness and a competition for those spaces if there isn't a careful progression of working with the communities and recognizing where the different fault lines exist within the communities. But I totally agree, Shaina, with what you were saying in terms of it being an outdated model, the secularization, and also that it being a Western imposition. And it's really important to recognize that when we work in different circumstances, to understand the context in which religion is understood there and the role of religion is understood there. oftentimes, let me just give an example. When I was working on the religious landscape mapping in Libya, I was asking about religious actors, and the phrasing religious actors even being used in that way was considered a Western imposition. So if we say religious actors, it assumes, a certain Christian hierarchy in the way that the words are being used in the Arabic. And so we had to very much think through, what in that context, how do they understand the actors that we're trying to map, and what kind of language can we use within that context to really be able to gather that information. And then also in terms of understanding religious frameworks, it's so pervasive. In Colombia, the women that we worked with in the ecumenical women's mediation group, they said, well, we do this work, yet we don't call it mediation. And religion can, with the will of God, doing the kinds of framing just sort of happens off the tip of the tongue, whether people are thinking about it being religious or not. And so coming in with this Western understanding and trying to fit it into a framework oftentimes doesn't work. And so it's really important to understand the local context and how religion is perceived and how religion is understood and used in the specific context of peace building or development work that you're doing. It's really important to understand that in order to be able to engage effectively in those spaces.
Right. I think we hopefully all know, treating any group as a monolith is not only a detriment to progress, but it's just insulting. And I think it's particularly interesting to the way we're talking about imposing structures, imposing language, even when we're looking at something like the global goals as a framework. How do you navigate UN processes without it then becoming an imposed way of doing or thinking about something, but instead as a helpful framework? Of course, we have so many things to discuss and so little time. So I now want to introduce my colleague, Jaya Lala, who's our Senior Global Education Manager, and who was instrumental in preparing for today's conversation. Jaya is now going to be facilitating our audience Q&A through the end of today's session. So Jaya, welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Shayna, and thank you to all of our speakers. I've definitely learned a lot, feeling very energized and invigorated by this conversation. We've had a couple of questions come in from Joshua and Shivani regarding the role of politics with religion. How specifically do peace builders work to separate politics from religion, especially when politicians are using religion as a means to exclude and include?
That's a tough question, and it's one that I will jump in on because in the World Bank, clearly that was one of the reasons why people were uneasy about engaging religious actors in a formal way, because the Articles of Agreement of the World Bank call for it not to be involved in the internal political affairs of its member governments. And yet the view was quite strongly that religion was in many senses about politics. And in many senses it is, because it can be about power and it can be about social relationships. So I don't think that there is a simple answer to that. And I think it comes back to what Palwasha was just saying, and which is very much part of what we at Georgetown and at the World Faiths Development Dialogue focus on, which is that you simply have to understand what the context is. And each country, each society, each community will have different answers. So, whether you have an established religion or even a compulsory religion or an official prohibition of religion, and you have countries which are examples of all of those, there clearly is a political dynamic in anything that affects organized religious traditions. So you simply have to navigate it and to have at least your eyes open to what is the relationship between political authority at the national or even local level and organized religion, some of the less formal, movements, etc. So keep your eyes open, I guess, is my effort to answer that question. Good question.
Great, thank you, Catherine. I wanted to kind of circle back to something you had also mentioned at the top of this discussion on the topic of opposition to including religion in kind of a generic sense when we're studying peace building. First of all, is there a particular solution to facing that opposition? Just as an example, when I was an undergrad, I had taken a class with Susan Hayward on the role of religion in international affairs. And a lot of my class, their first immediate reaction to even studying this topic was feeling anger about why are we studying religion in international affairs? So how can we, first of all, start building a dialogue for around this very important topic, as we've heard from this discussion? And then kind of the second part to this question is, in a UN sense, how can the UN do better in religious peace building?
Is that for me? Were you looking
For
at me?
anyone.
Okay, I'll let someone else take it then.
I'll jump in quickly just to say at least the way we're thinking about it in terms of the department. And it seems like a standard bureaucratic response is to provide more education to those that are participating in this area. So that means going through the bureaucracy, getting funds, and finding ways of providing training that help our foreign affairs professionals to be working in this particular area, to have a better sense of how to evaluate what it is they're working with, in the sense that Catherine just talked about, of context, how to assess context. Yes, I mean, separating religion from politics is not an easy thing to do, if it's even possible, as she's pointing out. I mean, so we need to understand the culture that we're working in and figure out, well, how do we work within that environment? And so what we're trying to do, and it's not so much in our case of trying to educate about specific religions, it's how to understand the broader society of which religion is a part and how it's integrated in so many parts of that society. So we're now working with USAID to do a U.S. Agency for International Development to do a collaborative training of our overseas partners. We've been working with an organization in Europe called the Transatlantic Policy Network for Religion and Diplomacy, and Catherine is an advisor to the advisory council on that. And so we're trying bit by bit to just kind of fill the overall conversation with these issues and get people more comfortable and more accustomed to working in this area, and not seeing it as somehow a betrayal of some sort of value that I work for a government, I'm supposed to be separate from thinking about this.
All right, so it seems like we have time for just one more question. I'm going to take the last question that was just posted in the chat for Catherine and Palwasha. How would you approach peace building in the United States through religious organizations?
That's a very timely question, isn't it? Because we have huge divisions to cross in the United States. And I think the implication of the question is very apt, which is that there are religious dimensions to this. And it is most obviously the complex evangelical communities, but the Catholic community is divided pretty much right down the middle, and of course has deep traditions of peace. So in the United States, I mean, there's talk in the United States about having some kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it is hard for me to imagine that there would be a single Truth Reconciliation Commission, but it is easy to imagine very diverse mechanisms that have the core objective of bringing understanding and facts and knowledge of each other. And I think in the United States, what's most likely is that you would have a mix of religious and non-religious organizations of very different kinds, rather than looking to a specific religious peace-building approach.
So USIP's work is outward facing at this point. Our congressional mandate allows us to do educational work inside the United States, but in terms of programmatic work, we're outward facing and do work more internationally. However, given the circumstances, we've been thinking about internally in USIP, what would we be able to offer here in the United States if we were given that opportunity to work domestically. And some of the ideas that have come out have been building on some of the work that we've done internationally. So, for example, we've looked at extremist movements around the world, including white supremacy or white nationalism around the world. And we would bring to bear some of our experience and research and how that relates to what happens in the United States or what's been going on here, as well as working with local institutions. And we've been doing some of the bridge building between local religious institutions in the United States and abroad and connecting some experiences. And so it would be a matter of sort of reversing, where we would bring reflections from other countries to the United States, bring to bear what has worked in religious peace building in other countries with similar contexts, and how the United States could possibly learn from those contexts. Of course, the work that we do at USIP is building on existing organizations, existing partnerships and networks at the local level, and facilitating those some of the dialogue and conversation between some of the existing networks. So given that also, we would look at in the United States where there already are existing networks that are working on some of these issues and working to build on those peace building initiatives domestically in the United States. But of course, this is all hypothetical because at this point, our congressional mandate is only internationally facing, and it's something that we're looking into, but we don't have a final answer in terms of whether at USIP we can actually do this kind of work domestically.
I think it would warrant maybe a year from now during our next Interfaith Harmony Week to reconvene this group and see what's changed maybe in the next 12 months. But as we are at time, and I think that's a strong place to close, I first and foremost want to thank Paula, Jaya, and Shivani for supporting today's event. I want to extend the warmest thank you to our incredible speakers for joining us. I really no better way to kick off this series. And I want to thank the attendees for your fantastic questions, engagement, points of discussion. This is an incredibly rewarding process to be a part of, and it's wonderful to be starting this year with you. So stay tuned. We'll be sending out an email with a number of the resources that were mentioned by our speakers, books, toolkits, what have you, as well as opportunities to become a member of UNA-NCA if you're not already. I'll also issue a save the date today. On the 25th of February, we'll be reconvening for a coffee chat on global health challenges. So stay tuned for more information there. Thank you again to our incredible speakers. Everyone, stay warm out there and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.